the implementation of this House prefers the implementation of positive memory loss over negative memory loss. I would like to call upon the Prime Minister. Here.
I guess I'm clearly audible and visible.
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Timer. POIs in chat, please. I'll take at least one, possibly one from each team. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Bit of framing. Negative memories laws limit and prohibit. It's about negativity is not about whether we look at it positively or negatively, but whether we eliminate it or enable and create something. When we eliminate it, we want to suppress and wipe from public knowledge entire events. Positive memories laws is when we actively push certain narratives on state media, in education class, emphasizing positive aspects of our history and moments that aren't contentious and our national pride. As a result, our goal is to foster patriotism as much as possible. Honestly, the last example in positive memories laws, prevent the dissemination of information that could be considered harmful to the country's reputation, sounds identical to me to the last line in negative memories laws, enacted to suppress discussion related to events that the government wishes to downplay or keep hidden from public scrutiny. I don't know how to separate these two. Closing opposition and closing government at the very least are nodding with me. Hopefully opening opposition won't try and be pricks and ruin it for the rest of us. Okay, let's move then to our arguments. We're going to talk about extent of buy-in, how we increase national unity on our side, and if we get to it, why we get more discussion on our side. First, a bit of a metric. What do we need in post-conflict states? I would posit that it is to turn them into non-conflict states. Every state was a conflict state at some point. We want them to have long-term stability. We acknowledge that in the short term, people aren't going to have much rights, especially the people who suffered from the conflict. That's true on both sides of the house. We think that on our side, we are most likely to create the conditions in the country within a few decades of stability where we can open up the past. As generations switch, as we're opened up to international external influence, as people who have experienced the conflict go and people who haven't experienced the conflicts come, all of that allows us to one day deal with it. If you prohibit discussion, though, you create dissent, you create undercover discussions, you create a populace filling in the holes that you create. Think Tiananmen Square, and you end up with a fractured populace in terms of what they end up believing. It harms your unity, stability, etc. Let's start then with extent of buy-in. Why on our side why do we think that on their side people don't follow this narrative? Because there's no actual narrative to cover. It's just, we don't know. It's prohibiting or penalizing discussion, acknowledgement, and recognition of certain historical events. That means that people do know that there is a cover-up. People have to know at least what are the things that they're not allowed to talk about so that they know not to talk about them. However, people don't accept we don't know. Curiosity is a very, very strong drive to people, especially people who are very skeptical of their government, as people in post-conflict states tend to be. When people do end up looking it up, they discover either the other side's narrative, which is oppositional to the country that they live in and are part of, and to their sense of patriotism and belonging to the country, or various conspiracy justifications for it from either side. Regardless, what they necessarily get is fragmentized narratives. On our side, though, people do buy into the narrative. Why? First, the government does focus on things that are true. It's a selective set of things. It's a partial set of things. It's a biased set of things, but they are true, at least insofar as the people think. People are also predisposed to their side's narrative. Why? First, they have an optimism bias. I see myself as good. I see my ancestors as good. I don't want to think of myself as a Nazi. But secondly, they've experienced it. So this is the side that matches their lived experiences. In a post-conflict, the winning side's narrative is going to be the experience that the winning side's people suffered through during the conflict. Finally, people want to buy into their side's narrative. It feels better. It feels better to know all the great things we did. Turks feel bad if they are focused on the Armenian genocide. They feel great when they're focused on Ataturk and the Young Turks and how they brought upon democracy and how they beat back the unfair treaty at the end of World War I and ensured that Constantinople stayed in their hands, and how they conquered over the Byzantines and became the new Rome in the first place. All of this makes people happier. People also fit in more as a result. Instead of everyone around me thinking something different and me not necessarily knowing what they think, fearing that people around me have different thoughts about those dark things, think Soviet Russia, I get to fit in with them. They all think collectively the same as me. Think, well, Putin's Russia or Trump's America. They all believe in the same very non-objective view of reality, but they choose to do it to fit in with each other. Finally, it allows them to feel nationalism. Everybody wants to feel that they deserve the land they're on, the country they're in, the symbols they have. They want to feel that their nation is something they should be proud of, instead of something that has done some stuff that are so horrible we can't talk about it. Note, supposedly, you could have both positive and negative memory, but the motion makes them mutually exclusive. That means oppositions cannot claim that they also mandate a particular version of historical events, focus on positive aspects of the nation, emphasize national pride, aiming to protect the country's image and foster patriotism. That uniquely falls to our side of the debate. Why is this important? No, let's take POI, closing opposition.
I agree we can't mandate it, but don't the government incentives you just laid out explain why the government is going to put out that kind of messaging anyways?
No, unfortunately, in the real world, any post-conflict state does both, but the motion defines them as mutually exclusive. This is the last thing I said before your POI as well. Wish you were listening to me. Okay, why is it important that we increase national unity? First, we avoid debates about how good or bad we are. Hidden debates, undercover debates that the government doesn't actually get to engage in. Second, we avoid anti-national sentiment among the majority and significantly increase pro-national sentiment. This looks like a feeling of security, a feeling of stability, a feeling of belonging. It looks like trust in the government. It looks like supporting the government, like enlisting, like paying taxes. Why is this the most important thing in the debate? Because the biggest danger to post-conflict states is a return to conflict. The best way to avoid that is to create as much buy-in to the national united identity as possible, to a collective. Israel exists because Israel did not ban discussion of the Nakba, but pushed forward a far more persuasive to Israeli Jews perspective on the independence war, as they call it, on why what they did was justified, it was minimally harmful, why they should be proud of their country. And that allowed Israel to continue existing and avoid another civil war. For all these reasons, go with opening government.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the leader of the opposition. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can be heard.
3, 2, 1. One piece of framing before I get into why discourse nationalism often suppresses minorities significantly within proposition. I just want to note the unity is broadly symmetric because it is unclear why you require history for unity. There are many other ways to access unity. The fact that you have common goals to opt towards, the fact that your culture is the same, that your codes are the same, the fact that your language is the same in most instances, the fact that you often went through a post-conflict struggle together, and in many instances you've undergone things like colonialism, that you have similar interests and things to fight towards, means that there are very large incentives to aim towards national unity. But secondly, this is also structurally true. I posit that governments have incentives to probably teach forms of good history or teach forms of national unity on either side of the house. So this often looks like messaging saying we must work together in order to ensure we don't fall back into conflict. Or that the future is really, really bright on our side of the house because economic goods are going to come in, because we need to stop conflict in order to promote reconciliation and healing. And in many ways, this is a likely narrative to be bought into because people don't want to opt back into conflict. They often want to favor this kind of optimism bias on either side of the house. This means there are incentives to unite in either world. The question then is whether we actively change this risk on our side of the house when you bring up painful memories and often engender things like nationalism within their world. Two things then in the speech. Firstly, what's likely the case, that you're going to promote harmful forms of nationalism. And secondly, what's likely the case that on their side, just get significant amounts of discussion that are unnecessary. First, a bit of framing on when this is likely used, because I think there are two instances where these kinds of things exist. The first is that this is often used in history curriculums in schools. That's to say that this shapes the way that you teach history to the next generation. And secondly, politicians often use this kind of rhetoric. So they often talk about old events like the Amritsar massacre in Pakistan or India in order to rile up hatred against probably Muslims, etc. We think those are the likely areas where this is used. First claim then, why is it likely the case you cannot critique on their side of the house? The premise here is that people are taught the same version of history throughout their entire lives. You often give this history within school, and politicians often utilize the exact same messaging. Secondly, for us to cut back against controversial events, in many instances, you just have to, in many cases, talk about events that were controversial under a particular light. Note that lying by omission, when you don't discuss controversial events, when you don't discuss Tiananmen Square and try focusing on other areas, it's equivalent to not having these messages there. Because on the comparative, you're actively changing the way that this history is represented. So when you say Tiananmen Square was an oppression of the average person, I think that's a significantly worse narrative. Secondly, though, and I want to be really clear, to form a national identity doesn't just happen overnight. You need to glorify the nation and often it's the glorification of certain historical figures. What this looks like is the ANC also being glorified in post-apartheid South Africa. It's meant to often have people within political parties like majority gaining significant amount of glorification. But it also means politicians discussing these events and saying our majority was the people who was wrong in this particular instance. What does this mean? Firstly, we would note that it often makes critique significantly more difficult because these parties often have significant amounts of power. It's unclear to me then how you're able to access any form of critique within their world, which is uniquely harmful at the point where this glorification exists. Secondly, this represses minority views to a much larger extent. Note positive messaging in most cases against minority views and favors a unified majoritarian national identity by combining 70 to 80% or like the 60% who necessarily won't. This often alienates the average minority, it makes it harder for them to be critiqued. Finally, though, when you put these people on pedestals, when you put them as people who've been glorified, it's just harder to call out any form of abuse by their party, which is why the ANC was able to engage in things like land grabbing on side proposition. We don't think that happens in our world. Two ways then that this is really, really poor. Firstly, this narrative is just not true. People know that they've just had a conflict. People know that there are massive harms and that there are big wounds. On the comparative, then, we think in many cases, even if you try giving this narrative, people discuss the history they want to on their side of the house. Politicians call out the Amritsar massacre. Politicians call out that the Hutus invaded the Tutsis and in many instances harmed us. Those are the kinds of things that happen in political and ideological discussions on the comparative. Secondly, though, this is more coercive because no stuff is now for healing at the point where the majority think they were the ones who formed the nation. I think that's particularly harmful. Before I move on, closing government.
Muzi, two can play at the game of trying to avoid a trade-off. If it is true that people will discuss this and become controversial, then to some extent we can suppress controversial discussions as well, and suddenly there's no debate. Except it, you cannot push a national narrative.
Yeah, so the national narrative just looks like, on our side, we're looking a forward-facing national narrative. That's what we told you. We're fine with not helping history, right? That's exactly what I said. Like, I don't really care about the historical narrative. Second question then, why is these discussions structurally harmful, and why do they create significant dissent against minorities in this side of the house? The premise here is that many of these discussions are controversial, and charitable instance, you have to have significant numbers of these discussions happen within proposition. Why are they likely to happen? Firstly, it's just probably true that you want to discuss this history. Your parents and others often suffered through this time, so they want to reflect back upon it. Secondly, politicians and others often use this rhetoric. Not necessarily an important form of rhetoric, because politicians are often motivated by ideology, and this is a great way to get people to vote for you. So they're often likely to talk about this on the comparative within proposition world when this isn't bad. This often looks like politicians discussing on TV, and these Muslims actively oppressed us. And it was the Mughals who engaged in all of these harms within India, which inflames conflict and rhetoric on their side of the house. Thirdly, though, I would just posit that even if politicians don't use this, there are very large incentives for you when you discuss these. Note that you often have differing views on these topics. They are controversial. So even if it is the case that you try engaging in a good discussion, this brings back painful memory. You often get traumatized when these discussions happen, and in many instances, feel your identity is violated and that you are significantly angered. This means two very specific things. One, you're likely to see more polarization in things like voting and significant amounts of harm. What this looks like is more people voting according to identity-based lines because these controversial events are repeated flashpoints that are brought up in history, but why you are fundamentally different, it doesn't allow you to take this positive messaging in the first place. Secondly, though, and this is super important, I posit that on their side of the house, this kind of discussion just means that you often create significant safety issues for things like minorities. You often make it much harder for them to opt into school and believe in the system because you're often told your version of events isn't valid. You're often told that these are the people who harmed you, and so majorities engage in significantly larger harms. The comparative proposition tries to push us, you can't suppress this. 3 reasons you can. 1, it's likely the case the governments implement things like fines and putting you in jail. It's very simple then at that point to not discuss this in public. Second, even if you discuss this within your houses, politicians can't do this on national television. News and other agencies can't do this. So even for the first 2 or 3 years, I don't think this exists within the long term on our side of the house. You often move past it. Thirdly, though, we're just able to heal better because you can focus on more recent events. You can talk about how this mistake and other types of things on our side of the house must be comparative in this. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hey, am I clearly audible?
Yes, you're clearly audible.
Governments have the opportunity to implement either one of these laws. They do not have the capacity to enforce them to the same degree. We're going to talk to you about why enforcement is simply better on our side and therefore more able to cultivate this narrative in 2 ways. First of all, we'll talk more about suppression and how it breeds underground conspiracies, specifically why that's so harmful. And secondly, I'll talk to you about why we simply get more of a true narrative, which is good both for objective truth and for limiting future conflicts. Before that, though, a lot of rebuttal. And note, OO has this weird tension throughout their case, where on the one hand, they want to criticize us by telling us, oh, nationalism is bad, whereas on the other hand, they want to claim nationalism falls to their side because they have other narratives for it. They can't have it both ways. But we are actually clear on this. Nationalism is necessary, and therefore, any trade-offs of certain rights that have to be lost in order for the nation as a whole to exist, we think we're willing to make. We already explained why. And so let's deal with their whole minorities claim on that one. 2 things to say about that. Firstly, I know debaters love running minorities, but often they just don't exist in post-conflict societies. That is to say, post-conflict often means post-Civil War, post some type of national or ethnic strife. That is to say, people very often divide along those lines into new countries. Therefore, in post-conflict societies, we think it is very often the case that these minorities are simply part of the other country. And while obviously we don't want them to be mistreated, we don't think that this government often has a ton of those minorities, the minorities who would be impacted by this narrative simply because they were just a part of that conflict. But secondly, we just think that at the point that we're trying to avoid conflict overall, and we need national unity in order to do that, we think all people are equally vulnerable. That is to say, we don't think that minorities are particularly vulnerable given the state of this entire country to begin with, and therefore we don't think they can be weighed above just because the word minorities often works in debate. We think they are, by definition, fewer people than the majority. Now, they try to tell us, well, they can create these things with a forward-facing narrative, but note, that's just not a motivating factor to serve in the military. A random group of people, hey, we can accomplish security, maybe, but we also just think, OO doesn't analyze this. They never give us a reason why this narrative would work, and I think the reasons we give you in terms of we are all the same people, we come from the same place, we have a just cause, come uniquely from history, and we have given you exactly the reasons why that exists. And by the way, to a degree, they concede this point, because by trying to hide history, they're essentially trying to avoid the fractures that come from history, meaning they recognize how significant historical narratives are in shaping people's motivations. Now, yeah, the last thing then is they claim that unity exists because you have similar language and culture. But look, post-conflict can mean post-Civil War. It can mean conflict with your neighbors. Basically, there are tons of situations in which neighboring countries have the same language and same culture, right? We think this is splits like, I don't know, countries within the former Soviet Union that fought with each other when it ended. We think it's like the former Yugoslavia. We think it happened in many civil wars throughout Africa. We just don't understand why it's unique to these borders. We don't think you can claim that there's, I don't know, there's so much of an overlap between the borders of the country and where they share languages and cultures. So we don't think that works, especially because often the other nation that shares your culture or language is actually going to be the enemy that you're fighting against in the army. So if anything, we need to separate from them. Therefore, those metrics don't work. Now, let's talk about why suppression is terrible. Because note, Everyone knows this is being suppressed. Like we already told you, if there's a law about it, if the law is being enforced, this means everyone knows you can't talk about such subjects. Note also that while we gave the example of Tiananmen Square, we think no post-conflict country actually has the Great Firewall of China or the capacity to stop information to that degree. What does it mean? It means people can find out anyway. Out, they feel like the government is hiding this. They are innately curious, but it's not just people can know. Specifically, the worst actors can know. That is to say, people who have the intent of feeling like the government duped them or lied to them or fooled them. These are people who are disenchanted, people who personally were there and know that this leader may not be such a great guy. These are people who can then spread the information. These are people who go around saying, hey, people, you are being lied to. Sheeple, wake up. Note this is not symmetric, because on our side, all of the narratives about this person are out there and they are positive. We can add negative information about him, but people have already formed an opinion because they know all sorts of good things that he did. Whereas if we've just covered it up and now one person tells us, the information that we're getting likely comes from anti-government sources. It likely comes from people who want to splinter the populace. And therefore, what we end up with is a lot of people who are disillusioned by their government, who are now threatened, who now feel like they're living in another dictatorship. They're being oppressed, much more likely there's civil war or at least civil unrest. They certainly don't build a national united narrative that's going to work. Now, and yeah, just scope of this should be very clear. The government is literally covering up deaths. In post-conflict societies, we are talking about wars. Well, we can co-opt the narrative and explain more successfully why these deaths were necessary or why it was a just war. Pretending they didn't happen and then having people find out about deaths is terrible. And also, it's very obvious because, hey, if your family members are no longer around, you kind of wonder where they are. And the fact that no one's allowed to talk about it doesn't mean you won't. Therefore, we get much more splintering. But secondly, let's just talk about why we get more of a true narrative and therefore less conflict with neighbors as well. Before that, opening anything? Closing?
So
Awesome.
I'm so confused about the asymmetry of your argument, because surely if you're endorsing one view, there are still anti-government sentiments that exist from the other side, which people can access beyond the firewalls you mentioned.
Yes, we think people can access competing narratives, but as we already told you, people do have a certain bias to buy into a narrative that makes them feel better about their country. It is simply the case that when you feel like you are being duped or lied to because they hid information, it doesn't work. But now let's be even more clear about this in terms of truth. Look, there's a limit to how much you can lie when the information is look-upable and discussed. That is to say, governments on our side are not making grand sweeping lies about what happened, because if people Google them and find out that they're completely wrong, then obviously the government is screwed. People don't buy the narrative. Therefore, we just think it's always enforced in a way that is somewhat sensible. When you're not hiding information, you can at least say, okay, well, we're going to teach things in schools, which maybe use rose-colored glasses, but they at least tell the truth. Therefore, we get people who, A, recognize this narrative to be true. They don't feel like they're being lied to, even if they get half-truths. People are willing to accept half-truths. But secondly, look, aside from the fact that we just think truth is important, we think there are fewer divergent narratives now. If you're hiding things, then your neighbors are telling a completely different story. You hate them and they hate you. But when both sides at least tell the same story and the same narrative, granted, they have different views on it, but we think we get less actual conflicting and contradicting information between the two sides, therefore less open animosity. We think that is also good for preventing intra-border and inter-border wars. For all of these reasons, opening government.
Very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. You're here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, CG, please ask POIs in the chat. I'll take you at around 5. I'll do 2 different things in this speech. I'll explain why positive memory laws asymmetrically are implemented poorly and foil negotiations for what these memory laws look like. I'll secondly talk about why the political landscape on their side is far more divisive. First, some framing about how these laws are most likely to be implemented. Keep in mind, when you are implementing these laws, you require buy-in from both sides, and this often looks like old guard and new guard parties making pacts with one another. For instance, Argentina's military junta negotiating with the new regime, or South Africa post-apartheid. The reason negotiations are relevant, especially given that this is a supports motion, is because empirically, when states are deciding whether or not they want to implement memory laws and what type of memory laws they want to implement. It most commonly happens in these cases. So given that premise, memory laws are asymmetrically done poorly on their side of the house. There are 5 reasons for this argument. The first is that negative memory laws can always be packaged as a neutral understanding that certain events broadly should not be discussed. By contrast, positive laws are always making a specific value judgment about what set of historical events should be discussed in the first place. For instance, you can only be Peronist or anti-Peronist. What that means is that individuals are far less likely to buy into the negotiations in the first place, given you are making that value judgment in the first place. Secondly, individuals on our side of the house are more likely to buy in as much as there's latent conflict fatigue that they have, and they often have aligning interests to put the conflict beside them. But here is the nuance that I want to add. They only will do this if it doesn't require simultaneously their pride being taken away from them. Because PM is right. People to some extent have prideful beliefs about their pasts and about their in-groups, but negative memory laws require fewer ideological concessions of their pride, and therefore it's more likely that both sides can converge upon them. Thirdly, it's easier for religious groups to broker negotiations about what these memory laws are going to look like. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that religion actually often takes a partisan stance within many conflicts that happen in post-conflict societies. Think about how they sided with dictator Diaz in Mexico in the 20th century, but also supported liberation theology in the late 1990s. And the reason is, even though they want to cater to everyone, they always need buy-in from a sizable group of people at one particular period of time, which often requires them to take a stance. This is often empirically true as well. On their side of the house, when you endorse one view, that means at least in 50% of cases, you get religious brokers who can often use spiritual rhetoric within the discussion to promote notions of healing within the discussion about what memory laws will look like. And they're less likely to buy into that on their side of the house when you are making an a priori value judgment about their religion and the decision they made within the conflict. Fourthly, the composition of political actors who are involved in the discussion about what the memory law looks like changes meaningfully. And our claim is when you are discussing negative memory laws, you're more likely to get moderate politicians who are a part of the discussion, in as much as I already proved that you are making less of a value judgment on our side of the house. So for example, in Spain, after the Franco regime, Suarez led the discussion about what the post-conflict pact would look like. And he was a softliner who was more receptive to the communists, despite his ties to Franco's regime. So that means you're going to propose more reasonable negotiations that both people like. But fifthly, on minorities, I think that the response from DPM is inadequate here. Minorities numerically have less power, so it's most likely that on their side of the house, when you're choosing to endorse one view, minorities are going to be shut out. They say, oh, well, in many cases, there aren't minorities. This just isn't true. Look to Myanmar, for example, with Rohingya Muslims. And obviously, there's the notion of diminishing marginal returns. If they were deeply suppressed, we owe a reparative obligation to them. I think the best possible response to this material could come from CG when they say, well, if you're making a value judgment about one side, that gives the other side bargaining power. There are 2 problems with this. The first is that this sets the tone for what the discussion looks like. So if you say, we are endorsing this positive view of history, the other side is likely to be deeply resentful. So even if they have some margin of bargaining power, they still feel deeply angry about the fact that you are saying that your side was a priori correct. But secondly, it's the opposite. You wind up feeling disempowered, especially because this motion is broad sweeping. It affects what's taught in schools. It affects what politicians say every day. So there are 5 reasons this wins the debate outright. 1, the quality of negotiations shapes the degree of cooperation you're able to get. If politicians on one side, for instance, support a negative memory law and you can converge upon the memory law being good, politicians can make the public understand why that's good. This also outweighs all of opening government's material on curiosity. And the reason politicians are able to do this is because individuals have parasocial relationships with them. They're the ones who, for example, were activists within the conflict who are leading the charge on one side or another. So when a politician says we are implementing this negative memory law, individuals feel more comfortable getting behind that. Secondly, buy-in shapes fairness of the implementation. If both sides can cooperate, it means you're more likely to get a negative memory law, which doesn't actively or asymmetrically suppress information. Thirdly, buy-in is a prerequisite to further cooperation. For instance, Muzi's material about the degree of fragmentation you would see in the political landscape. Fourthly, this preempts any CG argument about why suppression is going to be done badly. And fifthly, it means you can more robustly fund suppression, which flips opening government's argument about firewalls laws, because if you can fund a higher quality negative memory law, then it's less likely that people can even access that information in the first place. Secondly, let's talk about negative unity. So OJ has national unity. So OJ has two broad claims. The first claim they make is that this is going to be viewed as a cover-up. We already addressed the material in my first class about why politicians have political influence. So even if they are right, politicians say that this is unimportant given that they have political influence. So it doesn't matter that people think it's a cover-up because they're not looking into it in the first place. Secondly, it's literally harder to find that information when you're not talking about it in education to the same extent. Thirdly, parents have hesitation to expose their children to notions of conflict since they often involve notions of fear. Fourthly, obviously this is symmetric. DPM's response is you feel like you're being lied to. It's the opposite, given you're making a more politically charged statement on their side. You feel like you're being more lied to on their side of the house. Their next claim is that people have optimism bias, they want to feel better, they have nationalism. They're like, three mechanisms are really the same. So the issue with this is that people are more receptive to newer and more forward-looking notions of national unity. One, because people have latent conflict fatigue. But two, you can peddle it in a good way as a politician when you decide on this policy. For instance, point to the new constitution that you've established in the civil liberties that people can enjoy. So OG is out of this debate. Let's talk about our material. The first thing I want to point out is that historical events are not purely tied to specific conflicts. They're also tied to policies. Think about communist policies in Poland, the Meiji Restoration in Japan. There is less meaningful accountability for the policies you implement because on their side of the house, when you support this nostalgic view of history, you're associating it with the glory days. So it's harder for individuals to question and call out politicians when they engage in things like reckless social spending. But secondly, all of Muzzy's material about how parties are asymmetrically advantaged like the ANC, they capitalize upon narratives of independence, and they have the vindication now on our side of the house, which enables them to engage in things like backsliding measures. We prevent that on our side.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the member for the government. You're here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes, you're clearly audible.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The lines in the sand between my country and Muzzy's country are drawn in the blood of the people that were slaughtered after the fights that occurred after there. Post-conflict states occur because people fight each other because they don't recognize that they all believe the same. They think that they are different, that they are separate, and as a result, they don't have the empathy required to care for anyone else. Opening opposition says that if you stop discussion of controversial topics, then you are unlikely to get huge amounts of conflict. But they cherry pick examples. They talk about massacres and genocides, which I will address in a second. But what about the systematic discrimination of certain minorities? What about the idea that churches have explicitly been trying to lock Muslims out of getting jobs in places like India? What about the idea that you have actual riots, boycotts, people burning each other's homes down in the name of identity? They have to stop this discussion. It's controversial. It's highly sensitive, but they give you the exact mechanisms as to why it matters to people. Once again, Matt not taking a POI is quite indicative of opening opposition's analysis because they forget that there's an actual opposition in these nations, that people other than the government exist and they can gain power as well. Just like Matt forgets that he has to engage with the CG, often their case forgets you have to engage with local activists. And as a result, I want to point out something important. People on the ground who exist to represent minorities often have different viewpoints. The closing government case then is simple. First, why this narrative is exceptionally good and inclusive and it can be unifying, beating the opening opposition claim conclusively. Second, why this narrative is interpreted better than a vacuum, which leads to instability. Third, why that instability is possible and why the country is a powder keg. And fourth, why the government cannot stop it on their side, but it can on ours. First of all, how is this narrative formed? It is incredibly tense when you have a fight across ethnic lines. This motion cannot be relevant in nations where ethnic lines were not split apart because the identity and cultural history of that country was not then important the way you perceive that history. But also, presumably, if there was a conflict, identity was part of it. Presumably, there were some social narratives about the other side being evil. Presumably, there were some kind of splits across different lines. But more importantly, this is the vast majority of nations anyway, because in the developing world, colonialism explicitly splits apart apart these people to make them fight each other. So often the countries aren't just split apart based on ethnicity. DPM is correct that some are, but the vast majority of them are not, because they're explicitly put together to maintain control by pushing them against each other. Why is it good? First, the tense environment forces the exact coalitions Matt talks about, which means you have to consider other people's preferences. But second, leaders have to form a legacy. They need to keep the nation together. They need to maintain their power as the one who is unifying. But third, it's an immensely moderate state because the state is against conflict. It is pushing against the radicals. Let's address all of Matt's 5 mechanisms, which were really 4. The first claim is that certain events should not be discussed, and that is much better than picking some events that should be discussed. You know what's easier than that? Every event having the same explanation, which is that violence was the wrong answer and there was something within that event that sparked it outside of identity. In India, it looks like the British splitting people apart. In other nations, it looks like selfishness and the greed of people to lead people to their deaths because they wanted to simplify their own power. These unifying factors are human and simple and are not complicated. The history does not need to delve into the details of these conflicts beyond focusing on things outside of identity to push the positive claim that this was in fact a good set of people who were led astray. But second of all, on conflict fatigue and their pride taken away. You know what is worse than having your pride taken away through an event that you might not completely agree with? Being silenced by talking about your father or your grandfather who was killed in that war, or your brother, because it is a post-conflict state. You are often a soldier in the war that you can no longer talk about. Talking about how your house was burnt down is too controversial. The issue is, this is where OO misses the crucial comparative. Local leaders exist. OG talks about conspiracies. I want to make this very clear. In a second, I'll prove why local leaders can do this, but I'm going to tell you first why they want to do this. Local leaders want to push the idea that no one is letting you address the most salient part of your life, your religion, your identity, your ethnicity, what you've been discriminated on for the past decade, the way that made your family die in the first place. No one is letting you talk about it and gain the respect you lost from the blood that was spilled in your household. And that means that it is extremely easy to talk to these people in a way that is an echo chamber, not discuss it with the other ethnicities you've never been taught to relate to. But third of all, they say religion is partisan and minorities have less power. No, minorities and religion are forced to be unifying because in a post-conflict state, everyone has guns. Small groups of people can destabilize the nation. Alliances can form with 5% of the population that forces a net of destruction. If the state is seen as weak in one part of the country, it is easier for the rest of the country to see an opportunity to rise up. It is extremely volatile. Now, why is it volatile? And hence these unifying factors can be used well. How will people interpret it? And then vain. First, why it's volatile. Note, first of all, thirsting for a discussion and validation often means that underground recruitment is extremely easy because there's no other way for you to talk about it. The fines that opening government and opening opposition talk about are implemented by human people who need to believe in the fines, who need to believe this is the correct way forward, who need to believe what they're doing is correct. And if you cannot convince them, they will look the other way. It is easier for them to give you lighter sentences. And this is the kicker. You can vote the policy out. You can locally start pushing against it. You can have pushbacks against this policy in the first place. Before that, I'll engage with you, though you didn't with me.
So none of your material is actually responsive. If we get buy-in from local leaders, which you haven't engaged with meaningfully, they are willing to put the past behind them, even if they have somewhat of a connection to the past.
But they want to win the election against the majority party. So they want a competitive incentive. And their competitive incentive is that their ethnicity is being ignored and only they can talk about it. They want power because radicals are left over. Not everyone in the post-conflict state wants peace because they feel like they haven't been given what they want. But second, the belief in diversity is the only reason to cross the empathy gap, to see that blood on the ground as the same when it's from a Hindu or a Muslim, because you don't learn about their culture. There is nothing in your history textbooks about the meaning of diversity. The ancient history OO talks about and then randomly links to reckless spending is just vague enough that you can connect people's identities as humans together, but you can't on their side. And there's a capacity for people to pick up guns, to start discriminating in workplaces, to vote incredibly harmful policies, which you can then no longer discuss. We push this identity by pulling people together. But finally, this is very important. The interpretation of this is much more easy to accept because it validates your identity still exists and it is positive and linked to the state. The government should respect who you are, should accept who you are, and should admire you for who you are, as opposed to telling you to shut the fuck up and not talk about the fact that your house was burnt down because you were a Muslim. Extremely proud to propose genuinely for one of the first times in my life.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the government whip. Here.
I'll take one at like 5. Just call it out verbally. You can also put it in the chat. I may take one earlier, but if not, verbally fine. The first and most important clutch, why this will be done well. This puts us over opening government because they're vulnerable to the DLO response, which was just like, are people really going to buy into this? Won't this be seen as more of a cover-up, a burden that they did not analyze, we fill in? But I think this will also be comparative to the OO case and explain why it will likely be done better. There's a couple of things here. First, I just want to note how vague their conception of what narrative they want to create is on their side of the house, right? Like when Muzzy gets asked the POI, he fumbles around a bit and says it's just some kind of like vague forward-looking narrative, but presumably people will still ask like, what is your conception of the history that came before? And I don't think they have a meaningful answer for this. This is an immense burden on their side of the house to prove how this vacuum plays out. You need to consider how you will allowing people to, they need to consider how you will effectively regulate the veiled messages in churches and religions. This is the efficiency they question on OG, but never explain on their counterfactual. 2, how will this be interpreted from people on the ground? So the OO push at the bottom of DLO is just like, you need to do things that like necessarily have to pick a side. But there's a couple of problems with this. 1, Sharia explains why you don't have to do it the dumb way, that you don't have to say, oh, it was one specific party's fault, but you can blame the structural problems that led to this conflict happening. You can just say like, 1, violence is generally wrong, and we were able to realize that collectively and come to the idea that we should build a state. 2, you can say that the reason these conflicts happened wasn't because of any one group, but because like, just do what all debaters do and just blame it on white people. People love that shit. Just blame it on colonialism and the forces that be. This is likely what groups will agree on by their own mediation mechanism. That is, at the point where they have to come to the table and decide on what this narrative is, it's unclear why it is, and per CO's analysis as to why minorities exist, that one group would just let the other just completely paper over history and just have an incredibly like incorrect view of what happened here. So third, they say that like our side is value forward, whereas their side is value neutral. But again, if you buy the likely way that this would manifest, then it doesn't have to be like value forward in terms of preferring one religion or race or political party, because the narrative that you pick just is generally like vague enough that people can buy into the idea of patriotism and is not specifically endorsing one narrative here. I want to respond to something that came out of OO, which is just like, well, this is bad because maybe it like silences minority voices or things like this. I don't think they impact why it is that it is important that these local leaders be able to speak out, but also if these local leaders buy into this narrative that is a tacit consent on their part, that they internally weigh the stability of the state not backsliding over their ability to point towards things that happened because there is a story of how the country came together they buy into that doesn't exist on their side of the house when it is deeply unclear what did and did not happen in the history, and the state does not have the ability to coalesce around one specific narrative. So we answer the inherent question that these local leaders ask, right? Which is just like, what is your take? What is other people's take on like why this happened? How do you, a person from another, this is the empathy gap that Shari was talking about, right? How do you, this person from the other violent group, feel about the fact that someone from your family killed someone from my family and vice versa? We, as the state, have a unified answer to that question that appeases the vast majority of these people. They do not have a collective answer to this question, which then is used by these people on the ground to then jockey for power. So that's how we're ahead of them there. In response to CO's claims on why they're better able to do this, they have a couple of things. First, they say it is easier to know what happened, and it's easier to know like no words, like just ban saying Holocaust, but it's hard to build a conception of history. But again, I think they're misunderstanding what it means by a narrative. Like, we can just defend a pretty consistent value-based system and story of like how people like chose to agree on these things. I don't think we need a like play-by-play documentary to know every single body that was killed. That's obviously not the burden of what constructing a narrative looks like. Plenty of people buy into patriotism, but can't name 5 facts about how the country came to be. It is a narrative story, not a documentary play-by-play. So that is out. Second, they say global organizations. I think global organizations care more about the stability arguments that Sharia is proving to you. So I think that broadly deals with the main CO push here, right? Like, I just don't think it is the case that the capacity to tell these stories is suddenly so low that you need to do like a bunch of documentary analysis that could get you called out. I just don't think that is incredibly reasonable. Third and final question then is just framing what these states look like and why there's just considerably more violence on their side of the house. The intensifying discrimination and polarization that occurs when you stay in ethnic enclaves is a powder keg that opposition pushes under the rug. Even if you don't talk about history, the perception of identity still colors the future and current events, and we're the only ones who can access a cohesive sense of identity, whereas on their side of the house, local leaders are always going to say that they have their own individual identities. If people stay divided, every single crime or issue in the economy can be blamed on others and lead to conflict. So they never solve the issue that you don't see these others as humans at all, and we're the only ones who can push a unifying narrative. Is it the most accurate narrative? Is it a narrative that has every single detail laid out? Like, that's not the point of having a narrative in a country. And I think that that's something that oppositions needed to grapple with. Before I go to the third reason we have less violence, I'll take one from OO.
At your best case, if you blame historical conflict on another force, your own impacts about soldiers with guns getting angry are triggered because you are undermining, for instance, the duty that they did to their nation. This is why you have no capacity to do it well, even if you have every incentive to do it well.
I just don't understand this, right? Like, unless your argument is that they're going to be so mad at like the UK that like everyone in India with guns just crosses across Asia and goes there to shoot people up, like presumably they have some kind of anger. Our case is redirect that anger towards a central nebulous system of people who died 200 years ago that we can all be mad at and not at each other. I just don't think that's comparative. Third, on violence and why we're ahead here. If we prove violence, we are upstream of these CO claims on businesses and whatever, probably upstream of all the stuff on truth, whatever. So no one explains why the government's capacity to impose fines and jail people stays. We explain the power in the government, especially in post-conflict states where there is not a strong centralized government, but basically something that is like an artificial confederation of parties, comes from local minority leaders that agree with the majority parties, but if they lose their legitimacy, because on their side of house, they literally can no longer talk about their ethnic minorities, culture, and history, you literally lose your local linchpins, right? Because the framing, and this is just the interpretation of the policy for people on the ground who are not legal scholars, the interpretation from their side of the house is sufficient, right? At the point where they feel that they can't talk about it because there are specifically listed things that you can't talk about. We endorse a specific narrative that blanketly tells all leaders that this is the kind of narrative that people will buy into. On their side of the house, there necessarily has to be a pick and choosing, or they're just doing the gov policy, but listing 15 different things you can't say, which is obviously not something they can defend. It spirals out of control, and opposition never explains any of this because they ignore the counterfactual. They can't just say forward-facing narrative. They really needed to do a lot more framing out of LO. Sorry, Mosey. For all of these reasons, proud to propose.